You're listening to the Resilient Fertility Podcast, a space where we explore the intersection of food and culture on the journey to motherhood. I'm Anissa Woodall, a holistic certified nutritionist and mother of 2 adventurous boys. Join me as I guide you on how to reconnect with your innate wisdom, develop a growth mindset, and harness the power of food and habit to embody the mother your child needs you to be. Whether you're planning to become a mother, trying to conceive, or are already a mother, you'll find valuable insights and practical tips to enhance your fertility and optimize your pregnancy. Tune in every other week for thoughtful and informative conversations about the power in your hands on your journey to motherhood.
Welcome to the Resilient Fertility Podcast. Today, I am hosting Lily Nichols on this podcast. Lily is a pioneer swimming against the mainstream who has translated the research very beautifully regarding preconception and prenatal nutrition. Lily Nichols is a registered dietitian nutritionist, certified diabetes educator, researcher, and author with a passion for evidence-based prenatal nutrition. Her work is known for being research-focused, thorough, and critical of outdated dietary guidelines. She is the founder of the Institute for Prenatal Nutrition, co-founder of the Women's Health Nutrition Academy, where I have continued to further my own education on preconception and prenatal nutrition, and she's the author of 3 books, Real Food for Fertility, which she co-authored with Lisa Hendrickson Jack, Real Food for Pregnancy, and Real Food for Gestational Diabetes. Lily's best-selling books have helped thousands of mamas and babies and are used in university-level maternal nutrition and midwifery courses, one of them being the midwifery program at my own alma mater, Bastyr University. And they have influenced prenatal nutrition policy internationally. She writes at lilynicholsrdn.com and has an extensive library of articles questioning current best practices when it comes to nutrition recommendations and guidelines for women on their motherhood transition, from preconception through postpartum. My husband, Dr. Mark Woodall, and I hosted Lily on the podcast 3 years ago, and in our conversation in Season 1, Episode 20, we discussed the true concerns for mamas and babies when a woman chooses to follow a vegetarian or even a limited animal protein diet. Though there is much to be discussed on this topic, we covered the key concerns of what true protein needs are in pregnancy, essential pregnancy micronutrients often deficient on a vegetarian diet, the differences between animal and plant forms of nutrients, and the challenge of balancing blood sugar on a limited protein diet. Now, building off of the ideas that we discussed in that episode and understanding how critical animal foods are to the health of pregnancy and of your future baby, our conversation today is going to be the prequel to pregnancy. We're going to get into how you can set yourself up for pregnancy success from even before when you conceive. In this episode of the Resilient Fertility Podcast, Lily Nichols discusses her collaborative project with Lisa Hendrickson Jack, Real Food for Fertility. Lily elaborates on how the project originated, the extensive research process, and the crucial role of nutrition in fertility and overall body health. Key topics include the impact of animal-based proteins, the differences between preconception and pregnancy nutrition, and the often overlooked paternal role in pregnancy health. The conversation also touches on the debate around intermittent fasting, the biases when it comes to nutrition research, and practical recommendations for optimizing fertility through nutrient-dense animal foods. Welcome, Lily, to the Resilient Fertility Podcast. It's nice to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
It's been 3 years since we've spoke on this podcast, and you've been really busy during that time. So you've partnered with another fertility educator, Lisa Hendrickson Jack, who I hold in high esteem and have interviewed here on the podcast as well. I would love if you could just start out by telling us more about your new project, Real Food for Fertility, and how it came about.
Sure. So Lisa and I actually met a long time ago, 2015? I actually pitched myself as a guest on her podcast. I had just come out with my first book, Real Food for Gestational Diabetes. And yeah, we became friends, acquaintances over the years. And eventually, actually, we were both book writing buddies. When I was writing Real Food for Pregnancy, she was writing her first book, The Fifth Vital Sign. So we'd meet, regularly and hold each other accountable to our writing timelines and get feedback from each other on things. So we've been, intertwined as friends and colleagues for many years. And we both felt strongly that we kind of co-recommend each other's books for things. When I have somebody who is preconception, I'd say, well, you really can apply the information in Real Food for Pregnancy, but also you need to understand your menstrual cycle and how that's reflecting your hormonal balance, and understand your fertile windows so you know when to time sex and all the things. So get the fifth vital sign too. And that's like your duo. And likewise, when she had people who wanted to, take the nutrition information to a deeper level than she goes into in her book, she'd recommend Real Food for Pregnancy. And we're like, we really there's so much more to say beyond what we've said in either of our other books, that it really could be a book all in itself. And we both kind of felt neither one of us should take on the task alone, because we both have specific areas of expertise that I think are complementary. We have very similar styles of researching and writing that go really in depth. And so we decided to do it. It was a more than 3-year process. It was, I think, much harder than either of us. The book is substantially longer than my other books. It's about 30% longer than Real Food for Pregnancy. And part of that is with pregnancy, you're very limited with the scope of information that you cover just by default. It's, this relatively short stage of life. With preconception fertility, really we're talking about whole body health. And whole body health spans just about everything, right? I mean, we kind of reined it in. We could have gone even further, but we kind of reined it in, and we wanted to hit on, sperm quality and egg quality and some of the more common fertility challenges like PCOS and hypothalamic amenorrhea. But it really does go far beyond the content of either of our other bodies of work previously. And I mean, we're really proud of the result. I know it's a long book, and I don't want to scare people away from reading it, but we really were quite cutthroat with what information we decided to keep in it, because you really can kind of go on forever and ever when you're talking about fertility, as you know.
Right. And a common question that has come up in, both from my audience and just generally with my clients, is that, how does preconception nutrition differ from pregnancy nutrition? Because it is just one long continuum, right? And my perception of reading your books has been really that the research is different, in terms of the main things, right? Like the nutritional habits to me has been, of course there's going to be some differences, but there seems to be a common theme. How would you answer that question?
There is a common theme. And honestly, if I had not had people being like, Lily, I need a book on this, I probably would have just stopped at Real Food for Gestational Diabetes, because the overall, theme of it, nutrient-dense foods, macronutrient balance, maintaining blood sugar balance, eating to satiety, it's a lot of the same things, but for different reasons. And food and nutrition is so controversial and so complicated. Everybody wants to jump into the weeds on all these oddly specific things. And I mean, that's kind of my forte, jumping into oddly specific questions and getting really detailed on an answer. And here's the source for why I believe this answer is true. That, the common themes hold true. And I do try to remind people of that, because I get questions all the time. Well, what's the difference between the books and which one should I get? The difference is that there are indeed nuances for different life stages, even if the general principles truly do apply. When you think about, I'm going to throw out supplements as an option. You think about supplements for pregnancy and supplements for preconception, you're kind of limited just based on the safety data we have and what we know is overtly not a good idea in pregnancy with how far you can go with supplementation in pregnancy. Whereas preconception, I mean, take your pick. Obviously, some things will still be contraindicated as a whole, but it's a wide range of things. And we have very specific research on supplementation for supporting egg quality and semen quality, for example, or normalizing ovulation in women with PCOS, or nutrients of most concern in women with hypothalamic amenorrhea, or, there's so much nuance within it, even if the general principles kind of hold true. So yeah, the research is all different. It's all fertility specific research, and it's diving into all this nitty gritty stuff. Like, let's dive into the Mediterranean diet. Let's dive into whether meat is bad for fertility, because that seems to be most people's interpretation. Let's dive into inositol and the forms. Let's dive into CoQ10. There's just a lot of topics, breadth of topics that are covered that I haven't addressed elsewhere.
Yeah, and those are some of the topics that I do want to ask you about in a little bit. But just to kind of start this off, a common theme throughout your work, and really a common theme in the way I practice and why I'm so drawn to the way that you present your research, and I will also say that this is a shared value among the women in my audience, is to question mainstream approaches in general, right, to overall health. But when it comes to research for fertility and pregnancy, what kinds of biases do you find to be present throughout the way the evidence is presented? What's notable about the way these studies are designed, and how can these biases be potentially causing undue harm among women who are seeking to optimize their fertility?
Great question. So what I uncovered in this hunt, I guess it is not all that surprising, because I see some of these same biases in nutrition research as a whole. But it seems like some researchers come into this space with assumptions on what items or foods are healthy or not healthy. And then that bias kind of colors the way in which they design their research, or the way in which they analyze their data, or the way in which they discuss the data that they found. So let me give you some examples.
I love it.
So there's a very large study. They collated data of over 18,000 women, and then there's a number of research papers that have been written based off of this data set. And some of that research puts people into categories of ranking their diet or lifestyle like quality or health. And so in one of these examples, the group of factors that was considered detrimental to fertility, which included things like smoking, caffeine intake, low intake of vegetables, low physical activity, trans fat intake,
less veggies,
refined carbohydrates, added sugar, right? They stick meat into that category, right? Mm-hmm. So that kind of, and that's just like an assumption that meat is bad for fertility, so therefore it's going into this category, which is like, working against their, like, how well it's going to rank in the research, because the effects of meat have now been like muddled by all these negative factors. That's an example. Sometimes these studies, as much as like you want nutrition research to be looking at dietary patterns so you're not isolating a single component, the challenge is that how they define dietary patterns are, better or harmful, lifestyle dietary factors. That's up to the bias of the researchers. So that's one example. Another example is some of the data on, I'm going to cover the meat topic because I feel like that is the biggest bias that I saw in all the literature. So on the meat topic, I'm thinking of a specific study where they were looking at ovulatory function and source of protein in the diet. And I write about this in the vegetarian chapter of Real Food for Fertility. So hopefully I'll get this right because I don't have it open
it's on page
in front of me as I'm
I have
talking.
It open.
Oh, you do have it open.
Right
Yeah. Can you read the title of the study? I don't know if you see it. It's like ovulatory function and plant protein.
Oh, let's see. But I was told that meat is bad for fertility. Is that true? It's in that section. Yeah.
It's in that section. Yeah. Let me actually just pull it up so I can speak intelligently about that specific part, because I think the title of the study really says it all. Okay. So
I remember that.
Here it is. The study was titled Low Intake of Vegetable Protein is Associated with Altered Ovulatory Function Among Healthy Women of Reproductive Age. Okay.
And then you provided a better title for it later on in that paragraph.
I did, which I can read. But so the issue with this paper is if you just read the study title, if you just read the abstract, and that's it, which is what most health professionals do, because most people don't have the time. And you're seeing clients all the time. You don't have the time or wherewithal to be downloading full text of studies. And oftentimes they're behind a paywall too. So there's like extra layers that keep you from reading the full thing. Well, when you look closely at the study, and they weren't super clear on this in the discussion of the study either, but if you look at the data tables where they ranked the odds ratios of ovulatory dysfunction based on protein intake, meat was neutral. Processed meat, oddly, was highly protective of ovulatory function. I didn't dive into that in the book. I didn't want to go there.
And how many people are told to stop eating processed meat in
I know
an effort to improve their
and
fertility?
why the processed meat, right? Probably because it's contributing to higher saturated fat intake, which is supporting hormone production, but that's, I digress. Fish was protective. And then it goes into, I can't remember all the data off the top of my head, but then it goes into the plant protein options. And legumes were protective. Okay, that was beneficial for ovulatory function. But soy and meat alternatives was negative. And interestingly, nuts and seeds were negative. And yet the study title makes it sound like plant proteins are superior. Out of the 3 categories of plant protein that they analyzed, only 1 was protective, and the other 2 were overtly far worse than how any of the animal proteins fared, including red meat and processed meat. So what the heck? So as I write in the book, a more accurate title for the study would be high intake of meat alternatives, nuts and seeds are associated with altered ovulatory function, while processed meat and legume intake are protective against ovulatory dysfunction, right? The study title is not even accurate. And I saw this time and time again in the research. I only wrote about a handful of examples because it actually gets really infuriating when you're trying to sort through information. And especially if like you or I trying to put information on social media and you cite a source and then people go and pull up the source and they're like, you're lying. I'm like, no, you have to go into the data tables. You have to look at the full text. So it's challenging as health professionals in this space too.
And there was another study that you referenced, I think in this chapter, where the study was expressing how fish was protective, but meat was actually equally protective of fertility, but that they didn't include anywhere in the discussion of that study that meat was actually equally protective as fish.
Because we all know plant protein, fish, fruits and vegetables, whole grains, these are all healthy for us, and everything else is a problem, right?
And so I want to go back to one of the other studies that you had mentioned where the animal intake was lumped in with some of those more negative habits that are associated with impaired fertility. So smoking, less exercise, less veggies, more coffee, more alcohol. Tell us the interesting thing and the irony about the way that study presented, because there was 2 separate groups, right? Where there was women who had improved ovulatory infertility and women who had less ovulatory infertility.
Interestingly, the lowest rates of ovulatory infertility were observed in the group that had the highest animal protein intake. So, in that.
And also, I think what that can allude to is how protective eating animal foods can be on protecting the body from that kind of oxidative stress, right? Because smoking obviously is like a high oxidative damage kind of habit, right? Alcohol puts a lot of burden on the liver, right? Requires a lot of detox nutrients. But when it comes to providing your body with the resources to be able to handle that kind of oxidative stress, those nutritional resources are found in animal foods.
Exactly. The micronutrients, the amino acids you need to detoxify, to make glutathione, to combat oxidative stress. Yeah, it's in the meat. So it's truly ironic, right? When you look closer at this stuff. So you can imagine when I'm sitting here reading these studies and Lisa and I are connected in like a voice messenger app and I'm like ranting and raging through my phone at her. Oh my gosh, look at what I found. And likewise, she's sending me one about the sperm quality and, oh my gosh, they threw organ meats under the bus, and yet, look, it's actually beneficial for semen quality. How do they get this stuff, published?
Right.
It was truly amazing, I think, especially for her, since a lot of her research had been more in the hormone menstrual cycle thing. To see the overt bias in the nutrition research was actually really quite shocking to Lisa.
I want to take a quick break in the conversation here. If you're listening to this and you're wondering, how do I know if I'm getting enough protein when it comes to setting myself up for optimal fertility? Tap the link in the show notes to take my Are You Getting Enough Protein quiz to find out. You may be surprised by what you learn. Okay, now back to my conversation with Lily. So you also mentioned the Mediterranean diet. And so that is commonly a diet that is recommended for fertility. And my husband and I actually traveled to Greece on our honeymoon. And one of the first things I noticed was some of the key differences between the Mediterranean diet that I learned about in my university schooling and the Mediterranean diet that I was observing. Now, of course, there are modern changes to diets everywhere, but even some of the traditional practice. So can you share with us a little bit about some of the history of the research around the Mediterranean diet for fertility and what a true Mediterranean diet looks like?
Yes, absolutely. So the frustrating thing about basically all the information out there on a Mediterranean diet, and this is really important to understand because it helped me make sense of why things are the way they are. The original definition, the Western, US definition of Mediterranean diet actually came from Ancel Keys, who is the same researcher who created the diet lipid hypothesis, the whole concept that dietary fat is responsible for heart disease and therefore we need to limit it as much as possible, which is what the whole house of cards of our dietary guidelines is built upon. This very shaky foundation of his very flawed research with the study he published, the 7 countries study, exactly. So once you understand that, I think things get much clearer why we're still in this muddle that we are with the Mediterranean diet and why it is so vastly different than what people in the Mediterranean region consume. So when Ancel Keys went to that area, he only looked at dietary intake in one part of Italy and one part of Greece, and that was it. Part of the time that he was there, this was post-World War II, so there were areas that had been really economically disadvantaged as a result of the war, so there was a period of famine. So people are eating low amounts of meat because they don't have access to it, they can't afford it, they're starving. He also did some of his surveys during Lent, which of course is a time when many people give up meat or other items for religious reasons. So that muddles the research. So we can't really base all our assumptions on the truth of a Mediterranean diet off of that data. And yet that's where we're at. There's 21 countries that border the Mediterranean Sea. And so to think that the tiny an island of Greece and a tiny part of southern Italy is representative of the entire Mediterranean region is a complete farce because there's vast differences in dietary patterns in different areas. So I first started getting interested in this just from hearing reports of other people actually on social media. I started asking people about their experience with the Mediterranean diet. I think I still have an old highlight on my Instagram of people's stories about what they eat and traditionally eat, what their grandmother ate, what they ate when they visited, all the things. And it was man, this is a hot mess. And I got connected an Italian culinary historian who had written this really great write-up on the myths of a Mediterranean diet and kind of got me okay, this is actually kind of crazy. So the big question, though, is then why does a Mediterranean diet perform decently well in some of the fertility research or just health research as a whole? And the reason is the standard American diet is horrible. It's 58% of calories come in from ultra-processed foods. So if you put people on a diet, even if it is lacking in meat and too low in fat and only low-fat dairy and whatever, but it has more fruits and vegetables, more fresh foods, less processed foods, you're using olive oil in place of corn oil or canola, you're eating more fish, there's going to be a net benefit to your nutrient intake as a whole, even if maybe it's not optimal, because not all the fertility research, by the way, is positive on a Mediterranean diet. It actually has been associated with having a short luteal phase, which again is probably a reflection of not consuming enough protein or animal fat, because usually they're telling you not to eat meat and to choose low-fat dairy and all this nonsense. But as a whole, if you take a standard American diet of ultra-processed foods, like any dietary change, it doesn't even matter what it is going to show a benefit, because the standard is so low.
Okay, so moving on from debunking common fertility diet recommendations, you mentioned short luteal phase. So I think that would be a good segue into a conversation about recurrent pregnancy loss and miscarriage. So this is a common reason why women will often seek out my coaching, because for good reason, they don't want to keep trying, as they're being told to just keep trying to get pregnant when they keep losing pregnancies. It can take a huge emotional toll on both partners in the couple. And with each loss, I do notice that some women start losing trust in their body and their ability to conceive. And so if we can take preventative action, like we need to, right? And so I want to share a brief story about a message I just received from a client last week. She had endured multiple losses as a result of low progesterone and a short luteal phase. She just informed me that she's now pregnant. Her prior luteal phases had been about 8 to 10 days long, and that can be indicative of not having enough progesterone to be able to maintain a pregnancy, allowing for enough time for implantation. But in her previous cycle, right before she conceived, she told me that her luteal phase was 13 days long, and that she'd never tracked a luteal phase that long before. Had they been trying to conceive that cycle, she was like, I must be pregnant. But, she was kind of shocked because she was not actively trying to conceive that cycle. They hadn't been trying yet. But once she saw that 13-day luteal phase, she was like, okay, I think it's safe for us to start trying again. But I want you to speak to, what do you find to be some of the more preventative factors, or the more important factors when it comes to preventing pregnancy loss? Now, of course, there is going to be a natural amount of loss that happens, but of the ones that are preventable, what do you find to be the most important pieces for preventing?
Yeah, well, and to add on to the, short luteal phase, because that's a very important part of the conversation, and we have a just rampant rate of undereating among women that contributes to poor hormone production, low progesterone levels, and all that, is that we also bring men into the conversation too, because their sperm quality is actually a big part of this as well. And a lot of what I'm going to talk about applies to both partners. Mm-hmm. So just throwing that out there from the get-go. But for the vast majority, like if you look at recurrent, I guess miscarriage and recurrent miscarriage are they're related, but they're somewhat separate conversations, because just a single miscarriage can occur by chance. And the likelihood of that happening may change based on a number of different factors. But when you're having more than 2 or 3 in a row, depending on which guidelines you're using for how to define recurrent miscarriage, this is a time where we want to be more proactive about looking for some of the underlying potential reasons for what's going on. So if you look at all the potential factors that can underlie recurrent miscarriage, clotting issues that explains the vast majority of them. So if you haven't yet had some panels done with your health professional, that is something that's definitely worth looking into, because the success rates in pregnancies continuing in the future, when you have proper treatment with anticoagulants, blood thinners, or whatever happens to be the proper recommendation for your specific clotting issue, the success rates for pregnancies are fantastic. Like, it's a very good prognosis. It's very treatable. So definitely you want to rule that out first and foremost. Lifestyle wise, you want to be thinking about whether or not your weight is potentially too low or potentially higher than average. Either one can contribute to hormonal imbalances. If you have exposures to things that could be impairing your toxic burden, hormone balance, estrogen metabolism, so things like smoking, high alcohol intake, too much caffeine, exposure to just toxins as a whole is a big one. If there are methylation issues, so maybe there is a genetic variation in your MTHFR, that happens to be the one we have the most research on currently. There are different types of MTHFR variations. Some of them statistically don't have all that much to do with, chances of infertility or miscarriage. And then some of them are really highly correlated with a higher risk of recurrent miscarriage. So you want to run your genetics and see what's going on. In lieu of doing that, you want to optimize your intake of methylation supportive nutrients, including metabolically active forms of folate and B12 and riboflavin and zinc and vitamin B6 and choline and all the things, which primarily are concentrated in animal foods, by the way, as well as fresh produce. But tackling that can be huge. Just supplementing with the proper form of folate can vastly improve your markers of things like homocysteine and other inflammatory oxidative stress kind of markers that can cause a problem in early pregnancy, resulting in pregnancy loss. I would also just add general nutrient deficiencies as a whole need to be addressed. So if you have experienced this, working with somebody like yourself who can run full micronutrient panels and be specifically addressing those shortfalls will be helpful. Or if nutrient status is impaired because digestion is impaired, or there's something else going on, like an underlying infection or an immune issue, something else going on that hasn't been uncovered, it's like the list of possibilities of things that can underlie recurrent miscarriage is long. And I mean, you've seen firsthand, as I've seen myself in my practice, these often aren't really carefully addressed in conventional practice. A lot of times it's sort of written off as, well, it's normal to have a certain amount of miscarriages. Well, you're older, your egg quality is not good. Maybe pregnancy isn't possible. Like sometimes there's not as much willingness to kind of dig under the hood and see what's actually happening here. So you do want to have a good practitioner to help you with this because it can be complicated.
Yeah, and I think that's an important thing to note because a lot of providers aren't doing any deep dives. And I've seen clients who have kind of gone through the medical route of exploring their fertility. And I'm like, okay, what were some of the changes that they recommended? What were some of the tests that they ordered? And they're having them take synthetic folic acid as a protective. And what you're saying, just to kind of clarify, is that methylated folate is the appropriate, more bioavailable form of folate to be taking to prevent like a methylation issue when it comes to recurrent miscarriage. And that is also the form that is available in folate sourced foods, right? And so when we're taking folic acid, one of the things I learned from your webinar, the continuing education webinar through the Women's Health Nutrition Academy, was that I remember it was like even a single serving of Cheerios had far too much folic acid that would actually block the natural use of folate in the body, which I was like, whoa, like even just a single serving, I think it was like 400, was it micrograms?
Something like that, yeah.
But yeah.
So your body can only use so much folic acid at a time. It's somewhere between approximately 200 to 300 micrograms a day, right? So if you have a cereal that is providing 100% of the daily value, which population-wide is 400 micrograms, then your body is not going to be able to metabolically make use of all of that. And it's even more impaired if you have an MTHFR variation. So adding a 5,000 microgram folic acid supplement, which is the default for a lot of reproductive endocrinologists, actually worsens the metabolic biochemical issue in your system. It doesn't fix it. And you can actually correct it with a much lower dose of methylfolate or eating more folate-rich foods. And it's crazy that we're still having this rabid debate about folic acid. It's like wild how some people, they just want to stick to their guns on this, blinders on to all the biochemistry. And it doesn't work in practice. Mm-hmm. Like how often do you have a client where, they have recurrent miscarriage and they get treated with a super high dose folic acid and they have a positive result? It doesn't even work most of the time.
Yeah. And I think even if somebody is not supplementing with folic acid, but they are eating foods made with enriched flours, that can be a really big culprit. Just the other day, I don't eat a ton of grain products, but I do buy some sourdough sometimes. And even just like going to a general grocery store, I couldn't find a single bread product made without enriched flour. And when you see something that is made with enriched flour, it's indicating that there are synthetic vitamins, folic acid being one of them, that is being introduced to that food in an effort to microdose people throughout time. But yeah, so that's something I think to keep an eye out for and to consider, okay, what are going to be the food sources that will really help to replace this? And like you said, so many of the animal foods that provide folate also provide, like liver, for example, also provide those other methylation nutrients that you need to complete that full methionine cycle. So yeah, it's something that when we come food, that's always going to be the best place to start. And then to think, okay, if we are going to supplement, what is the right form of the supplement to be making sure that we're actually going to be doing good, not harm?
It's so simple, and yet it's so complicated for people to want to trust that it could indeed be so simple, because then you have to get people on board with consuming organ meats, which is an uphill battle in some cases, as you know.
Yeah. So. And that's part of a lot of the work that I do, is like helping people with the implementation of it. But coming back to, you brought up the male role in pregnancy loss, and let's just kind of extend this into pregnancy health in general. I would love if you could share a little bit more about what the paternal role is in when it comes to things like preeclampsia and placental development, because I find that to be very fascinating. And oftentimes women are thinking that it's their fault, right? It's nobody's fault, but like their contribution that is going to be the one that is responsible. But your findings and what you're sharing is that the men also have a pretty important role here.
They do also have a role, it turns out. So yeah, when we think about like, how do men contribute to this? Once the egg is fertilized and you have, the whole embryonic development, and then following that, you eventually have the formation of the placenta. The placenta is formed from embryonic tissue, and embryonic tissue has the DNA from both partners. But the placenta, interestingly, expresses more heavily paternal DNA than it does maternal DNA, which suggests that the health of the placenta, how well it embeds in the uterine wall, how robust the vasculature system is, that is somewhat determined by the health of dad's sperm. And if you look at the biggest contributions to maternal complications in pregnancy, a lot of these stem from an issue with the placenta, which it's somewhat manageable, but in some ways it's kind of out of your control, because you've already past the stage of placental development by the time these things show up. Right. Preeclampsia is a really good example of this. Preterm birth, risk of preterm birth is another one. But the preeclampsia one is very interesting. Some of the data suggests that 13% of preeclampsia cases are attributed to paternal factors alone, which is fascinating. I don't think I went through the data I'm going to talk about right now in Real Food for Fertility, but I have it in part of my training in the Institute for Prenatal Nutrition. But there's really interesting data on men who have already fathered a preeclamptic pregnancy. They're twice as likely to father another one with a different partner, regardless of the mother's pregnancy history. There's this whole theory, it's called paternal antigen theory, where exposure to a man's sperm for a longer period of time before conception is protective against preeclampsia. So they find that preeclampsia rates are higher if there's been a high interval between pregnancies, including a change in partners, if there's been a short time period of sexual intercourse with that partner before you conceive. The longer you're exposed to that man's semen, like the better. It's like your body builds up a tolerance or acceptance of it, or who knows. And this also, by the way, can be an issue with pregnancies conceived by like donor sperm, for example, because there's been no antigen exposure to that man's semen prior. But the data on like men having babies with multiple women, and you have these women who they had 2 healthy pregnancies, no preeclampsia, and then they have the 3rd with this man, new partner, preeclampsia. He has the same thing happens with another partner who previously had babies with no preeclampsia. Like they might go on to have another pregnancy with a different man and not have preeclampsia, which defines all the odds at an older age, right? Because you're older, you have a history of preeclampsia, and it didn't reoccur because you didn't have another baby with that man. So it's like,
this is like nature's way of encouraging you to stay with the same partner for life.
In some ways, right? Yeah.
Oh, wow, that's fascinating. And yeah, it's one of those things that like, it really shows just how much more there is to think about, you know, like you're talking about like the nuances when it comes to preconception health and pregnancy health and the outcomes. It's going to be more than just nutrition. Nutrition's a huge part of it, but you know, it can even come down to just having sex with your husband more often before you have kids.
Potentially. Wow. I mean, I haven't seen any research on like frequency of sex and risk of preeclampsia, but certainly like time with the partner that is associated with a lower risk. It's absolutely fascinating stuff.
Wow. Okay, so a couple of more questions before we wrap up here. One common hot topic when it comes to fertility nutrition is the topic of intermittent fasting. And this is one that I think there's a lot of different definitions and different ways that people are doing their fasting. I'm a big proponent of looking to the nuance and looking to the individual rather than saying like this one practice is going to be great for everybody. But I'd love if you could share about some of the research when it comes to ways in which intermittent fasting can actually be beneficial for women who are trying to improve their overall ovulatory function, their overall fertility, and then times where we need to be more concerned, or maybe it might not be a best practice for some people.
Yeah, thanks for setting me up for a way to answer this question with some nuance, because it's really easy to just come out screaming, you know, intermittent fasting is not appropriate for women, ever, mismatched for fertility, bar none, no exceptions, the end. And as a whole, I approach it with caution, right? The reason being the way in which most people approach intermittent fasting is with the goals of losing weight. And typically they combine it with a calorie restricted diet. So you're trying to lose weight and you're doing so via essentially skipping a meal, and you're not making up for the caloric intake from that skipped meal later on. Instead of thinking of intermittent fasting as I'm going to consume the same amount of foods, prioritize nutrient-dense foods, and eat them within a specific time frame in the day so my body has a little bit of rest time in between. And that's where the nuance is important. As a whole, the majority of research on intermittent fasting is done in men. Men are much less sensitive to short-term deficits in food intake, whereas women are quite sensitive. I mean, the quickest way to interfere with menstrual cycle regularity, ovulatory function, all the things, hormone production, is to undereat. And that disruption can start as early as 4 to 5 days of undereating. But you certainly typically see it at the very least within 3 months. Like 3 months of eating at a 25% caloric deficit, you're going to start seeing issues in the cycle. It often happens sooner, but you start seeing those fairly quickly. So the times in which I think intermittent fasting is not a good idea is if somebody is prone to undereating as a whole, they have high energy expenditure, like they're an athlete, there's a history of disordered eating, they're already having signs of potentially like a luteal phase defect, short luteal phase spotting before their cycle, scanty ovulation, scanty menstruation. There's signs that like hormone production might not be super great. You don't need to push the envelope further, right? You want to be eating at regular intervals. The information, the data we have on hypothalamic amenorrhea, for example, even like in the middle of the day energy deficits can be problematic for hormone production. So for those women, eating at very regular intervals is absolutely vital. On the flip side, you have some individuals who are prone to insulin resistance, and they kind of have trouble mobilizing their fat stores, and they're not super metabolically flexible. Maybe they have polycystic ovarian syndrome. There has been some data, it's a small amount of data, but there has been some research into using intermittent fasting for women with PCOS who are overweight and therefore can likely benefit a bit from some weight loss. And the way that they did that study is super interesting because they didn't do intermittent fasting the way that most people do. Most people do intermittent fasting by delaying or skipping breakfast. In this study, they had women eat all of their food between 8 a.m. and 4 p.m. Not saying that's realistic for everybody, because certainly for me as a mom of 2, that's not realistic at all. But I'm sharing the study first. You make up your mind if it makes sense for you, right? So they had their breakfast at 8 a.m. They finished eating their dinner at 4 p.m. There was no caloric restriction. They actually had certain measures in place in the study design to make sure that their caloric intake did not dip too low below their baselines. They were eating the same amount of food, shorter eating window. And they had dramatic benefits in just about every single possible thing that you measure with PCOS. First of all, they lost weight. Most of that was from body fat, so they're not losing lean body mass, they're losing body fat, so a healthier body composition. They had lower androgens, like improvement of their hormonal profile, better glucose, better insulin levels, all the things better. So if you fall into that category where you're kind of like in the PCOS camp or any sort of condition where there's some insulin resistance component, I think intermittent fasting could possibly have a place, but you still want to approach it with caution, because I think we all know people who have tried to do intermittent fasting and it's like just a mismatch for their physiology. Mm-hmm. I should also mention that not every single person in that study, again, it was a small study, majority had benefit, but not all of them did, meaning it may not have been the right intervention for them. So our biggest recommendation, the biggest takeaway, hopefully, if people do end up reading through the intermittent fasting section of Real Food for Fertility, is that you want to be really watching your menstrual cycle and make sure that you're not having certain warning signs come up, and we list all of those out. So it's, again, approach it with caution, but we do acknowledge there can be a time and a place where it certainly can be beneficial.
And I've seen that to be true, because if we think about PCOS and insulin resistance as a risk factor for gestational diabetes, right? Because we know that when you have insulin resistance going into pregnancy, there's also a higher risk of developing gestational diabetes or even just high blood sugar in pregnancy. One of the things that I've found interesting is that I've had a client who started seeing me. I think you actually referred her to me maybe 5 years ago for managing gestational diabetes. And I had her doing intermittent fasting throughout her pregnancy, which probably a lot of people would be like, oh, how dare you, you have to appropriately nourish a pregnancy, which we were very careful about making sure that she was getting adequate nutrition, but it was a matter of extending her fasting window overnight by a couple of hours. But that was the only thing that would touch her fasting blood sugar in the morning, and she's started working with me just recently. She's now 46 and she's okay. I'm perimenopausal. My insulin resistance is going up again. Unfortunately, she's always been more prone to vegetarian eating. And so that's kind of been our overall challenge working together. But, she recognizes that she needs to be eating more protein, that she needs to be eating more animal foods in general. But one of the things that we're starting to do again is, okay, this intermittent fasting is something that your physiology has shown to be beneficial in all of the ways, right? And she's like, I can't get my fasting blood sugar down. I was like, okay, well, you're not fasting overnight. Let's introduce that again. And so it's one of those things that for the right person, it can be really helpful. And coming back to the topic of animal protein and meat, when it comes to macronutrient balance and blood sugar balance, let's just talk a little bit about how that has both an important role for blood sugar balance, but you talk a little bit more in Real Food for Fertility about the specific amino acids that are present in animal foods that have important functions in fertility. So I just want to touch on that briefly before we wrap up for today.
Sure, I can touch on a handful of them. This is an area that really excites me because the research on amino acids has expanded so much in the last 20 years, just based on the way in which we can watch how amino acids are metabolized and oxidized in the body. It's absolutely fascinating. And I think part of the thing that kind of colored my approach to this whole project is when you have clinical experience showing something to be true time and time again, and then you're coming up against all this evidence, it's like, meat is bad, meat is bad, meat is bad. And then you start digging into it and you're like, oh my gosh, all of these amino acids found in meat actually have super key roles in oocyte quality and sperm quality and ovulatory function. No wonder it was fairly consistent that you observe improvements in all of those things when you get people eating a sufficient amount of protein. Wow, imagine that. So some of the amino acids that I go into, this probably isn't all of them because I'm just speaking off the top of my head, is glycine. Glycine is another amino acid that I cover in Real Food for Pregnancy. So that's required by developing human eggs as well as growing embryos. It's also required for sperm health, sperm quality. And of course, we need it in our body because it's the major component of collagen too. So you need it for really all the collagen in your body, which is the most abundant protein in the body as a whole. When it comes to fertility, I think one of the reasons why it can be so helpful for those things is that glycine really helps to combat oxidative stress. It helps to lower blood sugar. It helps to lower blood pressure. It's a component of glutathione production, so helping with liver detoxification and how well you can handle exposure to toxins, which sadly is just inevitable in our life. And glycine, one more thing I'll add is that glycine's involved in methylation as well. It's a methyl donor, just like methylfolate or methylcobalamin are methyl donors. So it is involved in that whole methylation cycle. If you have methylation getting screwed up, you will see issues with both egg and sperm quality because it's just a fundamental, very important role or function process that happens in every single cell in the human body, of course, including egg and sperm cells as well. So the challenge with glycine is that it's a little bit difficult to get enough glycine if your diet is only plant foods. Even on an omnivorous diet, it can be a challenge if you're not eating more traditionally, like nose to tail eating, because it is found in the collagen-rich parts of the animal food.
Skin, the bone, the cartilage.
Exactly. And we live at a time where most people are just seeking out, chicken breast or steak, and they're not seeking out those other cuts. So this is a reminder to get your, bone broth going, get your slow cooker out, get some meat on the bone, throw a whole chicken in the crock pot so you can get the benefits of glycine. Another key one is taurine, which is found pretty much only in animal foods. They look at plant foods and it has just trace amounts. Literally every organ and tissue in the body benefits from taurine intake, and it is in extremely high concentrations in follicular fluid and also in semen. And in many ways, it acts as an antioxidant and also helps with supporting hormone production as a whole. Taurine is most concentrated in seafood, especially like oysters, clams, mussels, and also meat. So that is one where if you're not consuming animal protein, you're just probably not going to be getting much or any taurine. It really is in such small quantities in plant foods that many times it's not even detectable. I'll cover two more so I don't go into too much detail. Carnitine is one that is helpful for fatty acid oxidation. So like most people would just call it fat burning, how well your body can burn fat for energy, not only what you're eating, but what your own body fat stores. It also seems to be helpful for maintaining fertilization, supporting embryonic development, semen quality, egg quality, even implantation of the embryo into the uterine wall is supported by higher carnitine intake. And there's quite a bit of research now on carnitine supplementation for fertility issues, for improving ovulatory function, for improving IVF outcomes, for improving semen quality. And carnitine you find primarily in red meat, deeply pigmented red meat. The darker the meat, the more carnitine it has. So you will find far more carnitine in red meat than you will in poultry. But even in poultry, the darker meat, like legs, thighs, are going to have more than breasts. You have really low amounts in plant foods. So the majority of what you're getting really is animal foods.
It comes from carne, right? Like meat.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, carnitine. Creatine is the last one I'll touch on. There are others that we could go into. And your creatine metabolism actually increases at different time points in the menstrual cycle, including ovulation and also during pregnancy. It seems to support placental and fetal development and function. It seems like creatine might play a role in how receptive the uterus is to an implanting embryo. It's used in tissues that have a really high energy requirement. So you can imagine the uterus at the time of conception and during pregnancy, that's a high energy demand organ. So our creatine metabolism is like upregulated during those stages. This is another one where you really only find it in like flesh animal foods. And there's been some interesting conversations in the research on maybe we need to, like all of these other amino acids I've just talked about, talk about potentially classifying it as an essential amino acid because it has so many benefits on whole body health. And if you are not eating animal foods, your creatine status is impaired because your body has to use all these other amino acids to try to make it. So you're like you're borrowing from like your body's other needs for things like glycine and arginine and other amino acids to try to create creatine endogenously. And your body really does have trouble keeping up. So I'm of the opinion that you want to be getting creatine in your diet if you really want to optimize fertility. And I will tell you the number of messages and emails that I get from people sharing the most miraculous improvements in their menstrual cycle, conception stories when they were like not able to conceive for 5 years, improvements in their partner's semen quality after the semen quality was like so low, it was like barely even detectable, just by adding in animal foods. It's right. Insane. Like it would blow your mind, the stories that I'm getting on at this point at a near daily basis, especially after this latest book. Because my other books, I kind of skim the surface on the topic. In this book, it's like, okay, we're going all in. Like we got to go here.
And that is why like my number one recommendation for so many of my clients when they first start working with me is you have to get enough protein. That is our first goal. And if you're not getting enough protein from animal foods, then we're not going to work on anything else until we're at that point. You know, it's one of the things that I've been talking about so much lately, especially because there are so many women who are told they need to be avoiding meat and they need to be either going vegetarian or just limiting their meat intake. And it's doing them harm. And
Absolutely.
It's worsening their ovulatory function. It's worsening their hormone balance. And, you know, just considering all of the amino acids, right? Like today, we didn't even talk about the micronutrients, right? All of the essential micronutrients, which we touched on a lot in our first episode. So if you want to hear more about that, go back and listen to our first episode. I'll link it in the show notes. But yeah, I think when it comes down to it, eating enough animal foods is going to be the number one thing that most people need to be doing to even touch their fertility challenges or even just to prepare themselves for having an easeful pregnancy journey and preconception journey. So thank you for sharing about all of the research. Thank you for doing all of the research. I first found your work when I was, I think in my last year of grad school, and you had just released Real Food for Gestational Diabetes. I was like, I like her. She knows how to question the mainstream and is willing to kind of go out of the box of what so many dietitians are tied to. You know, they're kind of contained within this box. And so thank you for being the trailblazer in this field.
Happy to do this work. It may have taken me 3 books in to write a whole chapter on vegetarian diets, but it's here. It's hard because, you know, I've personally been vegetarian before. I have loved ones who are still currently vegetarian. I have a lot of compassion for everybody and all of their reasons for eating different ways, but there are certain things that just become sort of a theme in your work and sort of irrefutable anecdotes repeatedly again and again and again I mean, I didn't even talk about vegetarianism whatsoever in Real Food for Gestational Diabetes because it was like, why am I going there? Because that is not a dietary pattern that I find helpful for blood sugar management. My vegetarian gestational diabetic clients were by far the most challenging to get their blood sugar in range. I mean, there was just no possible way without isolated protein powders to get them enough protein without contributing to hyperglycemia. It's not possible. Their insulin resistance was far worse than any of the other clients that I had ever worked with. And that still holds true to this day. And so, it's hard sometimes writing. I don't like to highlight the negative, and I try to approach my writing in a way that it still remains empowering, but there are some things that simply have to be said. And I think especially nowadays with so many people really being told from all the different angles that you need to go plant-based, you need to cut down on your meat consumption. Although I do feel that shifting just a little bit in the last year or so. It seems like there's more people who have tried and failed at veganism and are coming out of it more so than ever. It still is the common messaging, and it still is the general messaging that people get from public health and all the sources, if not for your health, for the planet, right?
Right.
And unfortunately, the planet part is not my area of expertise. That's Diana Rogers' forte and Savory Institute and others. But from the health aspect, let's really dive into all of this, uncover all the holes to this. And I've had so many health professionals thank me for that research because, again, it's very time consuming. It's ridiculous how much time this shit takes to put together. People would be appalled at the thousands of hours that go into a book at this caliber. But they're like, this is what I keep observing in practice. As much as we try to optimize the protein intake, it doesn't move the needle on their ovulatory function. It doesn't move the needle doesn't help them get pregnant. It's not helping do this. It's not helping do this. It's not until we introduced, and sometimes it's a very limited list of foods, not until we introduced oysters and eggs that we were able to get ovulation to normalize. Sometimes it actually doesn't take that much. People don't actually all have to go full on tons of meat all the time. I mean, some individuals really do need a lot more protein, and there are some individuals where they can still be going ham on their plant protein, no pun intended, and then add a little bit of choice nutrient-dense animal foods, and it makes a world of difference. It's shocking sometimes how quickly you see those results. I'm sure you've had examples of this in practice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And in my own health too, right? I was vegetarian for a long time and, made a huge transformation in everything when it comes to my overall hormone balance, my energy. I'm a completely different person than I was, 12 years ago.
Yeah. Wild.
But yeah, so it's crazy. And I'm glad to be seeing this shift. I'm glad to be part of this shift with you. And yeah, we just got to keep working at it. And for those of you who are intrigued by this conversation, I highly recommend reading Lily's book, Real Food for Fertility, and all of her books, Real Food for Pregnancy, Real Food for Gestational Diabetes. Lily, can you tell us where is the best place to purchase those?
Sure. So probably the best place to go is just go to my website, rdn.com. Right in the top menu bar, there's a drop down or a place in the menu bar for books. Just click on books and it'll show you the best places to purchase all of those. And yeah, check out my blog. There's hundreds of articles. They're all free. Some of the ones we kind of touched on today, there's a big article on folate and folic acid. That was a helpful one sometimes to share if you have a stodgy reproductive endocrinologist that you want to maybe educate a little bit. You could send them that article. So do take a peek at that. Let's see. And then over at Real Food for Fertility, we do have the first chapter of Real Food for Fertility available for a free download. So if you have any questions on what do you cover in the books, it's not in your other ones, that has the table of contents in there so you could see what's in there, plus the intro, chapter 1. Mm-hmm. So you'll get a good feel for what the sort of book is like if you go ahead and download that. And as far as social media, you can find me on Instagram. I'm moderately active. I know you called me out recently for, is this your first reel? I hate reels, sorry. And my handle's the same as my website, so it's RDN.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, and I also just throw out there that like if you do have a reproductive endocrinologist or a doctor who you're working with who is combating you on some of these topics, like just give them the book or show it to them or, something where
right.
it's, if they're having a massive impact on all of their clients, like they better be doing their job right.
Yeah. I know it's always a hard balance. I get a lot of questions on like, how should I deal with a provider who doesn't want to? And part of me is just, we'll just fire them and find a new provider.
Right.
It's harder than that, though. It's easy
Yeah.
for me to say that. It's harder than that. A lot of
Same.
people are in areas where that's like the only option or all the things. But yeah, sometimes that goes over well. A fair number of health practitioners have said, oh, I learned about your books because one of my patients gifted it to me. I was like, oh, really? And so that might go over well. It might not go over well. You be the judge.
Totally.
That one.
Totally. Okay. Well, thank you, Lily, for your time. It was so great to have you.
Thanks again.
Now, I hope you're beginning to understand just how important getting adequate protein from animal sources is to your fertility. But you're starting to think, I don't have time to make all that food. I don't even know where to start. Or do I really have to weigh and measure all my food just to restore my hormones and fertility? Don't worry, I got you. This summer, I'm planning to run a 10-day 100-gram protein challenge. Now, of course, everybody is different, and for some of you, 100 grams may just be hitting just the tip of what you need. But here's the thing. Most women I work with aren't even getting that when they first start out with me. So I want you to experience some big wins in a short amount of time. This challenge is designed specifically for women who are eager to enhance their vitality, balance their hormones, and optimize their fertility through the power of getting enough protein. Throughout this 10-day journey, you'll discover why protein is a cornerstone of hormonal health and fertility, more than what we talked about today. I'll guide you in reaching a daily intake of a minimum of 100 grams of high-quality protein, focusing on whole, unprocessed, and primarily animal-based sources. No complicated diets, powders, or restrictive food trackers necessary, just simple, intuitive eating that aligns with your body's needs. Expect to receive daily emails packed with valuable information in bite-sized portions, practical tips, and video lessons to help you easily incorporate more protein into your meals. By the end of this challenge, you'll be starting to feel more energized, on the road to hormonal balance, and empowered in your fertility journey to take the next steps towards hormonal wellness with ease. This challenge is open for pre-sale now, so save your spot and you'll start receiving the emails at the end of July. Click the link in the show notes to join the Fertility Boost in 10 days, the 100-gram protein challenge today. Join us and take the first step towards achieving the hormonal harmony and the fertility that you deserve. Let's boost your fertility together. And now it's your turn. Restore your fertility, conceive naturally with confidence, and grow your healthy baby. If you want to learn more about how you can support your fertility, check out my free masterclass, Unlock Your Fertility, How to Transform Your Habits for Optimal Pregnancy Success. And if you're ready to have my step-by-step strategy for how to personalize your own preconception protocol so you can conceive your dream baby on your own timeline, it's time for you to join me in Resilient Motherhood. Click the link in the show notes to join. I hope to see you there.
Thank you so much for listening today. I really do appreciate you choosing to spend this time with me. If you gained value from today's episode, I'd love if you can act in reciprocity and share this episode with a friend. Screenshot your favorite part to share on your social media, tagging me at Anissa Woodall Nutrition, and leave a review in Apple Podcasts. This serves me to expand my reach of connecting with women who need this medicine. I'll see you on the next one. I hope you already know, but for legal purposes, I need to share that this podcast is for general informational and educational purposes only and does not constitute the giving of medical advice. The use of this information and the materials linked to this podcast are at the user's own risk. Each user is responsible for making their own decisions when it comes to their reproductive health. Remember, you are always the sole authority over your health, and if your case requires medical attention, use your own discretion to ensure that your needs are met. Thank you for listening.